Now you might think you know everything there is to know about this guy, the RX 9070 GRE. But look, we're late with this video, so I wanted to approach this from a completely different perspective. Because look, it's been a month and a half since this thing launched broadly across the world after being available in other regions for quite a while. But now that we've been able to buy it for a good amount of time, we can analyze where it actually lands in the grand scheme of things against the competition, some of which has gotten more expensive, some of which has actually gotten cheaper. Not only that, we also have to acknowledge the fact that this is going to be used in the vast majority of cases as a drop-in upgrade for an existing system. And based on some of our findings, you might completely change your perspective about the 9070 GRE. The problem here is that from day one, even before it launched in Canada and the US, it was facing a pretty big uphill battle. Right now, it's going for exactly what AMD said it would, so $550 in the US. And while the GRE has just 12 gigs of VRAM, AMD's own 16 gigabyte RX 9060 XT costs about $100 less. And yet the biggest challenge here probably comes from AMD's own lineup. It's the vanilla 9070, which is hovering at a point that's just $30 or so more expensive than the GRE. Meanwhile, it offers a ton more horsepower on paper. Meanwhile, the similarly priced RTX 5060 Ti 16 gig is around the GRE's price point too. And that's really the problem with having such a tightly packed lineup, isn't it? Any movement whatsoever on pricing will cause a trickle-down effect that can make or break the performance per dollar equation for absolutely everything. And right now, from a raw money and spec standpoint, the GRE looks like it's in a ton of trouble, especially against the regular 9070. But is it actually in that much trouble? Well, like I said before, the answer might surprise you. Because what we want to do here is test both sides of the coin. On one side, we have the 9800X3D, what is arguably one of the fastest gaming CPUs right now. On the other side of the coin, we have a Ryzen 5 5600X, which is indicative of what a simple GPU upgrade path would look like in a slightly older system. Basically, the 5600X is also an awesome step upwards for people using an older AM4 processor who just want a CPU performance boost. As I'm recording this, you can get one of these for around $180. So combine that with the GRE and you'd be looking at under $800 for what'll be a solid gaming uplift versus a Ryzen 2000 or 3000 series CPU. And you won't even have to touch your system memory either. And speaking of the GPUs we used here, well, it's pretty much the expected lineup that would be cross-shopped against the 9070 GRE on both sides of the fence. But there are two big exceptions. One of those is the 7900 GRE, which also launched at around $550 a little more than 2 years ago. And there's also the 6700 XT as an example of what somebody might be upgrading from. Now, regarding the charts, I'm going to explain this one more time because I know that it's caused a little bit of confusion in the past. We want a direct A-B comparison here. So that means showing both CPUs in the same chart. The 5600X results will be on the left, and those can be compared directly with the 9800X3D's numbers on the right. And straight from the get-go, the two processors perform identically across all GPUs. There's some small deltas here and there in the 9800X3D's favor, but those are well within the margin of error. You'll actually see this carry as a trend over most, but not all of the games we tested. As for the 9070 GRE, well, it delicately threads the needle between the regular 9070 and the 9060 XT 16 gig, and almost doubles the 6700 XT's performance here. And those numbers are actually closer to the 5070 than any of the 5060 series. But again, the 7900 GRE, a card that was launched more than 2 years ago at the same $550 price point, is able to take the 9070 GRE to the cleaners. And yes, I get it. Based on their names alone, these are two very different classes of GPUs. But that price tells a completely different story. Also, if you can get the regular 9070 for within like $30 or $40 or $50 of the GRE, then absolutely go for it. It'll net you a lot more consistent frame rates. Battlefield is actually the first game where we're seeing some big benefits with the X3D chip, at least with the 1% lows. If you're using a GPU that's faster than a 9060 XT or 5060 Ti, stepping up to a faster CPU will give you a much more fluid gameplay experience, even on the 9070 GRE. On the other hand, when we run into a game that's GPU bound, there's no way to tell the difference between these processors users regardless of the GPU being used. Here, the GRE is 31% ahead of the 9060 XT and just 12% behind the 9070, which is a pretty good result all things considered, especially when you take into account the RTX 5060 Ti 16 gigs is almost 20% lower, but it costs about the same price. Meanwhile, Baldur's Gate loves, and I mean loves, AMD chips with 3D cache. That leads to a performance plateau on the 5600X where every graphics card except the 6700 XT got essentially the exact same numbers, including the new GRE. Move up to a 9800X 3D and most are able to stretch their legs, but there is a limit here. The 9060 XT and 6700 XT are still GPU limited, so moving to a higher end CPU doesn't actually affect them all that much. But for all of you AM4 users, look, there is a solution for this, and it will cost quite a bit of money right now if you're looking for a new CPU. Pop your own X3D into this system and you'll be off to the races with almost identical results as the 9800 X3D. Now you might expect that exact same situation in a CPU limited game like CS2, but that wasn't the case at all. Here it doesn't matter which processor you're using. The numbers are pretty much identical, with the AM4 system actually holding a slight edge, likely because of its much tighter memory timings. CS2 and the Source engine, it absolutely loves those tight timings. As for the 9070 GRE, well, its position hasn't changed, with it fitting in right between the RX 9070 and 9060 XT, but it does struggle against the NVIDIA GPUs, which have always held an edge over AMD in these types of titles. On the other hand, the RTX 5060 series becomes really hard to recommend at its current price in more GPU heavy games like Cyberpunk. The 9070 GRE is plainly able to deliver better frame rates either in a new build or as a drop-in upgrade. It all comes down to pricing though. If the 9070 maintains its sale price of $580 or so, the GRE feels just like pointless. But if the GRE gets a cut to maintain its $100 price delta with a higher end card, well, it's a pretty good option if you want to save that money. And as for Space Marine, well, we're talking CPU limitations again for many of the GPUs here. But while most don't have the graphics horsepower to encounter a frame rate ceiling on the 5600X, the 5070, 9070, and 7900 GRE obviously do. So while the 9070 GRE is technically tied with the 5060s here, they're all living in a sort of like sweet spot as an upgrade solution for an older system. None of their potential gets wasted. Again, we're seeing a very small lead right across the board for the X3D in Rainbow Six, especially with the 1% lows for some of the NVIDIA cards. And yet the 9070 GRE is immune to that, for the most part at least. As a matter of fact, this makes it a much better fit for an older system than a mid-range RTX 5000 series card, at least in this game. The story in Warhammer is pretty much identical to the other GPU limited games here. It doesn't matter which CPU you have, be it a 5600X or brand new 9800X 3D. The mid to mid upper range graphics cards like the ones we have here will be the bottleneck long before your processor. But if we focus solely on where the 9070 GRE lies, well, look, AMD designed it to parachute right into the space between the 9070 and 9060 XT 16 gig, and that is exactly what it does. And it also pulls pretty far ahead of NVIDIA's RTX 5060 Ti cards. So after all of those numbers, I guess we need to sort of like distill things down into answers for those two questions that I first posed in this video. The first of all is, right now, where does the GRE land in the grand scheme of things, right? Because it's been on the market for weeks and weeks and we're actually able to analyze it properly. The other one is, how does it do as a drop-in upgrade solution from a CPU scaling perspective? And that's where I first wanted to go here. Basically, what we're doing here is averaging all of the numbers out across 10 games that we tested. So when going from a 9800X 3D to 5600X, we're seeing slightly higher tier cards like the 9070, 5070, and 7900 GRE lose between about 7 to 10% of their averages and 1% lows. On the other hand, the 7090 GRE sees only a 5% hit, and the lower power 60 series cards generally see even less of an impact when moving from one processor to another. But remember, the 5600X results in Baldur's Gate 3 were terrible, which lowers its overall score. When we remove that, performance becomes nearly indistinguishable between CPUs. And yet there is one exception. The higher end cards get consistently better 1% lows with the 9800X 3D. But what about the 9070 GREs standing in today's GPU landscape? Well, that's not so clear cut, because in the grand scheme of things, it is about 33% faster than the 9060 XT. So in a lot of ways, mission accomplished because that lower end card hasn't received any substantial price cuts lately. Meanwhile, that vanilla 9070 gives an additional 23% frame rate uplift. So on paper at least, that $100 separating one card from another should make it sort of like mission accomplished for the GRE, right? Well, not so fast. We need to talk about reality here, not some mythical MSRPs, because in the US, regular 9070s are going for under $600. In some cases, substantially less than that. So the GRE looks like completely overpriced. Those extra dollars spent on the higher end card give you much better performance, not to mention more memory. Meanwhile, here in Canada, 9070s are actually getting a lot harder to find. And when you do, they're either versions without great track records, basically very low customer reviews, or a hell of a lot more expensive than the GRE itself, sometimes by hundreds upon hundreds of dollars. And that really poses some questions, right? And that is, do those launch day reviews like we do, where we're given like US dollars, euro, and maybe sometimes British pounds, really give the full perspective about where these GPUs lie when they're actually in the market? And the answer to that is no. They give you a snapshot at that time about where everything might end up being. Here with the GRE, in some regions, like I showed in the US, this card is just overpriced, right? I can't recommend it. On the other hand, in Canada and maybe where you live, well, it's actually not that bad because the cards that live above it are so like hideously overpriced. It sort of becomes that like great mid-tier option if that's what you're looking for. But even then, now, more than a month after launch, the GRE is facing an uphill battle, right? Mostly because it finds itself in a pretty tight spot as a newcomer without any discounts whatsoever, playing in a field of cards that frequently go on sale, especially south of the border. And even sometimes here in Canada, if you catch a 9070 or 5070, getting some sort of price cut. So here's my advice if you're shopping in like the mid-tier to upper mid-tier GPU market. Do not go in with a single card in mind. Have a little bit of flexibility in your budget. And no, I'm not talking about like $100 US or something like that. Maybe like $50 US or the equivalent thereof in your region might actually get you a much better GPU than you might be expecting. And absolutely, positively, when you're in this price category, don't sleep on the used market. There's some amazing cards out there. I mean, you look at where the 7900 GRE was in our testing, it's like mind-blowing what it offered 2 years ago at the same price as the 9070 GRE. So anyways, I'm Mike with Hardware Canucks. I hope that you enjoyed this sort of unique perspective about the GRE and where it now lands. And I will see you in the next one. Have a great day, guys.